My mom went to Europe for a month, left me with $20 at age 11. What CPS found made her. I'd always tell people, even now, that if you want to see the real me, the one that clawed its way out of the ashes, you have to look at the scar on my left elbow. It's faded now, a pale, thin line against my skin, but it's a constant reminder of the day my mother, Patricia, packed 2 massive suitcases, kissed me goodbye with a perfunctory peck on my forehead, and declared, "Darling, I need to find myself in Paris. Don't be a bother." She handed me a crumpled $20 bill, a sum that felt both insultingly small and terrifyingly large to an 11-year-old who'd never been left entirely alone before. "This should cover your provisions," she'd said, her voice dripping with an indifference that would become a recurring theme. Provisions, as if I were some stray animal she was temporarily boarding. My father, Richard, had been gone for 2 years by then, a quiet, dignified man, a lawyer who'd always put his family first. His passing had fractured the pristine facade of our suburban life in Greenwich. Patricia, it turned out, had been clinging to a life she no longer had the substance to support, a life built on Richard's steady income and his unwavering presence. Without him, she'd started to unravel, and her coping mechanism was, well, it was spectacular in its awfulness. Europe. She'd always talked about Europe, about the art, the history, the culture she felt was so lacking in our staid Connecticut existence. I guess she decided she couldn't wait for me to develop a palate for fine wine and existential dread. The first few days were surreal. I ate cereal for dinner, watched reruns of Saved by the Bell until my eyes burned, and talked to the answering machine, leaving messages for a mother who was undoubtedly sipping espresso by the Seine, utterly oblivious to the void she'd created. The $20 disappeared faster than I expected. My allowance had been $5 a week, and that was for spending money, not for provisions. I started skipping meals, surviving on crackers and the occasional apple pilfered from the fruit bowl. I told myself it was an adventure, a test of my nascent independence. Patricia's parting words echoed in my head. Don't be a bother. I certainly didn't want to be a bother. Then came the second week. The $20 was a distant memory. My stomach gnawed at itself with a relentless hunger. I was terrified, of course, a deep, bone-chilling terror that seeped into my dreams. But beneath the fear, a strange sort of clarity began to emerge. Patricia had chosen this. She had chosen Paris over me. She had chosen her own self-discovery over her daughter's basic needs. And in that realization, something in me shifted. The dependent child began to recede, replaced by something harder, something observant. I remember looking out the window one afternoon, the sun glinting off the manicured lawns of our neighbors, the perfect embodiment of the privileged life I'd always known. It felt hollow. My mother's emotional bankruptcy was no longer a secret. It was a gaping, tangible absence in our lives. My father's study, usually a sanctuary of quiet order, had become a dusty shrine, filled with his untouched books in the scent of aged paper. His absence was a constant ache, a phantom limb. Patricia's absence, however, was a violent amputation. The neighbors, the kind elderly couple next door, the Millers, started to notice. Mrs. Miller, a woman whose kindness was as abundant as her perfectly trimmed rose bushes, began leaving casseroles on our doorstep. At first, I'd pretend I wasn't home, too proud, too ashamed to admit my mother was elsewhere. But eventually, hunger won out. I'd creep out, grab the foil-covered dish, and retreat back into my self-imposed exile. I ate those casseroles alone, in the dim light of the dining room, the silence of the house pressing in on me. I imagined my mother laughing in some smoky Parisian cafe, completely unaware of the quiet desperation unfolding just across the Atlantic. It was Mrs. Miller who finally called. I heard the soft, concerned murmur of her voice on the phone when I hesitantly answered one evening. "Sweetheart, is everything all right? We haven't seen you playing outside lately." My carefully constructed facade crumbled. The dam broke. I couldn't speak, just sobbed into the receiver, a torrent of pent-up fear and loneliness. She was there within minutes, her face a mask of worry, her sensible shoes crunching on our gravel driveway. She took one look at my tear-streaked face, the empty kitchen, and the general state of disarray that Patricia's absence had accelerated, and her eyes hardened. That was the moment the grown-up world, the world of consequences and interventions, began to intrude. CPS showed up the next day. 2 women, one stern and efficient, the other younger, her eyes filled with a cautious empathy. They walked through the house, their gazes sweeping over the dust motes dancing in the sunlight, the unmade beds, the overflowing ashtrays that Patricia had somehow managed to accumulate in her brief, frantic preparations for her Find Myself excursion. They asked me questions, gentle at first, then probing, their professional demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos they were witnessing. I told them about the $20, about Paris, about the answering machine. I didn't embellish, didn't lie. The truth, in its stark, unvarnished ugliness, was more than enough. What CPS found in that house was not just neglect. It was a profound abandonment. They found a child left to fend for herself, not just financially, but emotionally. They found a mother who had abdicated her responsibility with a callous disregard that was both shocking and, for me, strangely, liberating. It was then, sitting in the sterile interrogation room at the precinct, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, that I learned about the extent of Patricia's financial machinations. My father, the meticulous and loving Richard, had left behind a substantial estate, trusts, investments, property, a nest egg designed to secure our future, to provide for me. And Patricia, his beloved wife, had been the sole executor, the sole beneficiary of his considerable wealth until I came of age. The CPS worker, Miss Evans, her voice low and steady, explained it to me. My father's will was ironclad. Patricia had access to a significant portion of the funds for her living expenses, but the bulk of it, the true inheritance, was locked away to be released to me upon my 18th birthday. However, there was a clause, a rather significant one, that granted Patricia significant control over my upbringing and education, especially in my minority years, as long as she was deemed a fit guardian. Apparently, leaving an 11-year-old with $20 and booking a one-way ticket to Paris was not considered fit. The look on Patricia's face when she was finally tracked down in a quaint little hotel in the Marais district was something I will never forget. She'd been alerted by the embassy, a frantic, indignant phone call that had clearly interrupted some momentous cultural awakening. She arrived back looking disheveled, her expensive scarf askew, a fierce, almost feral anger in her eyes. She hadn't anticipated consequences. She hadn't anticipated being brought back like a delinquent child. And she certainly hadn't anticipated me. When she walked into the living room, expecting to find me cowering, terrified of her wrath, she found me sitting on the sofa, perfectly composed. The house was still a mess, but I had cleaned the kitchen, scrubbed the countertops until they gleamed. I had even done the laundry, folding my mother's silk blouses with a precision that belied my age. Miss Evans and a stern-faced detective were there, their presence a palpable weight in the room. Patricia's eyes, accustomed to seeing me as a helpless dependent, widened in disbelief. I wasn't crying, I wasn't pleading. I was still. "What in God's name is going on here?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "Who let you people in my house?" Miss Evans stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Mrs. Davenport, we've received reports of neglect. Your daughter was found to be unattended." Patricia scoffed, a harsh, brittle sound. "Unattended? I was gone for a month. She's a big girl. She can manage." That's when the detective spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Mrs. Davenport, your husband's will has specific stipulations regarding his estate and the care of your daughter. It appears you have not met those stipulations." Patricia paled, the arrogance drained from her face, replaced by a flicker of something I'd never seen before. Fear. "What are you talking about? Richard's estate is mine." "Not entirely," Ms. Evans said, her tone measured, "and not without responsibility. The court has been petitioned to place temporary guardianship elsewhere. Given the circumstances and your current legal standing, there are serious questions about your continued ability to manage the estate and your daughter's well-being." Patricia stared at me, her eyes narrowed. I met her gaze, unflinching. In that moment, the power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The little girl who'd survived on crackers and fear was gone. The child who had been left with $20 and a world of silence had learned a brutal, vital lesson. My mother thought she was leaving me with nothing. She was wrong. She had left me with a void, yes, but also with a cold, hard clarity. She had left me with the knowledge of my own resilience and a burning, quiet understanding of what it meant to be truly abandoned. And in that understanding, a seed of something else began to grow, something that would take years to fully bloom, but which was already taking root in the wreckage of my childhood. The humiliation of being left alone had been a sharp blow, but the dawning realization of my mother's true character, coupled with the revelation of my father's foresight, was the real turning point. I was no longer just the abandoned child. I was the inheritor of a fortune and the architect of my own future. And my mother, Patricia, had just unknowingly set the stage for her own downfall. The fear in her eyes wasn't just about the CPS intervention, it was the dawning terror of losing the control she had so carelessly wielded. She had left me with $20, but she had also left me with a weapon. The next few weeks were a blur of supervised visits, stern lawyers, and Patricia's increasingly hysterical outbursts. The house, once a symbol of our quiet affluence, became a battleground. I was placed under the temporary guardianship of my Aunt Carol, my father's sister, a no-nonsense woman from Boston who believed in routine, discipline, and making sure everyone ate a balanced meal. She was a stark contrast to my mother's performative dramatics, and I found a strange comfort in her predictability. Carol was blunt, practical, and utterly unimpressed by Patricia's tears and accusations. She didn't coddle me, but she made sure I was safe, fed, and attended school. Patricia fought it, of course. She accused Carol of wanting my father's money, of orchestrating this whole thing to gain control of the estate. Her voice, usually so melodious, became a grating whine. She'd call me, sometimes late at night, sobbing about how I'd ruined her life, how I was a cruel, ungrateful child. I learned to disconnect, to let her words wash over me without penetrating. The fear that had once gripped me had been replaced by a quiet, unwavering resolve. I understood now that her rage wasn't about me. It was about her loss of control, her inability to maintain the gilded cage Richard had built for her. The legal proceedings were slow and draining. My father's will was intricate, a testament to his meticulous nature. He'd anticipated Patricia's potential for self-destruction, or at least her tendency towards impulsive, financially disastrous decisions. While she had access to a generous allowance and certain assets as long as she remained married and acted as a suitable guardian, the bulk of his considerable wealth, including the family's sprawling estate and various investment portfolios, was held in trust, to be released to me upon my 25th birthday. Patricia, as executrix until my majority, had been granted broad discretion, but the court, after the CPS intervention, saw her actions as a gross dereliction of duty, a clear violation of the spirit, if not the letter, of Richard's trust. The lawyers, Mr. Henderson for the estate and Patricia's hired gun, a slick, shark-red man named Sterling, sparred in hushed tones. I overheard snippets, legal jargon that sounded like a foreign language, but the undertones were clear. Patricia was in deep trouble. Her access to the trust funds was frozen pending further review, and she was being investigated for financial impropriety. The court was leaning heavily towards removing her as executrix entirely. The emotional toll on Patricia was evident. Her carefully maintained facade began to crack under the pressure. She'd always been so concerned with appearances, with projecting an image of sophisticated elegance. Now she looked haggard. Her designer clothes seemed ill-fitting, her makeup was often smudged, and her eyes held a constant, desperate gleam. She'd lost weight, and the sharp angles of her face were more pronounced. She was a woman unraveling, her world collapsing around her. During one of the court-ordered mediation sessions, I sat in a sterile conference room, flanked by Aunt Carol and Mr. Henderson. Patricia sat across from us, looking defiant, but her hands trembled as she clutched her designer handbag. Sterling, her lawyer, had just delivered a stinging rebuke regarding Patricia's reckless spending of estate funds on lavish trips and dubious investments that seemed to vanish without a trace. "Mrs. Davenport," Mr. Henderson began, his voice measured but firm, "the court has reviewed the financial records. There are significant discrepancies. Your explanation for the depletion of the contingency fund is unconvincing. Frankly, it appears you have been treating the estate's assets as your personal piggy bank." Patricia's eyes flashed. "That's an outrage. Richard entrusted me with everything. He knew I had expensive tastes, that I needed to maintain a certain lifestyle." Aunt Carol snorted softly, but I kept my gaze fixed on Patricia. This was it, the moment of reckoning. Sterling interjected, his tone smooth, attempting to de-escalate. "My client, like any widow, has had to manage significant expenses. There have been unforeseen circumstances. Unforeseen circumstances like a month-long find-yourself tour of Europe with a prepaid credit card?" Mr. Henderson raised an eyebrow. "The court is not buying it, Sterling. Not anymore." Patricia's composure finally broke. Her face contorted and a choked sob escaped her. "He left me with nothing. He's always favored you, Carol. And now this child, she's turning everyone against me." She pointed a trembling finger at me. I didn't flinch. I looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not a grieving mother, but a woman consumed by greed and self-pity. Her carefully constructed victimhood was pathetic. She had traded genuine love for material possessions, and now she was losing everything. "Mom," I said, my voice steady, though my heart was pounding. "Dad left me a future. He trusted you to safeguard it. You didn't." The raw honesty in my voice seemed to stun her. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The fury in her eyes flickered, replaced by a dawning horror. She was starting to grasp the magnitude of her mistakes. The court eventually ruled in my favor, removing Patricia as executrix. She was granted a small, fixed monthly allowance from a separate trust, enough to live modestly, but a far cry from the lavish lifestyle she'd enjoyed. The estate, including the mansion, the investments, and everything my father had worked so hard for, was placed under the management of a court-appointed trustee, with the understanding that it would all eventually pass to me. Patricia was stripped of her power, her control, her access to the money that had been her lifeblood. The day Patricia was forced to vacate the mansion was a turning point. She stood on the manicured lawn, a single expensive-looking suitcase at her feet, tears streaming down her face, not of sadness, but of pure, unadulterated rage. She glared at the imposing house, at the place that had been her kingdom, now denied to her. She looked at me, standing beside Aunt Carol on the porch, and her eyes promised retribution. "You'll regret this, Sarah," she spat, her voice laced with venom. "You've made a terrible mistake. You have no idea what you've done." I simply watched her go, a strange sense of calm settling over me. Her threats, once terrifying, now felt hollow. She had lost, and I had won. But the victory was complicated. The humiliation of my childhood, the years of feeling invisible and neglected, had left their mark. Patricia's words, however, had planted a seed. "You have no idea what you've done." I hadn't fully grasped the extent of her desperation, the lengths she might go to. I had focused on regaining what was rightfully mine, on securing my future, but I had underestimated the venom of a cornered viper. As I moved into the mansion, now my temporary home under Aunt Carol's supervision until I turned 18, I began to delve deeper into my father's affairs. Mr. Henderson, a man of quiet integrity, guided me. He showed me the breadth of Richard's foresight. Not only had he set up trusts for me, but he had also meticulously documented Patricia's financial history, her penchant for risky ventures, and her tendency to borrow against future assets. He had clearly suspected she might squander the inheritance or mismanage the estate. One afternoon, tucked away in my father's old study, surrounded by the comforting scent of leather and aged paper, I found a hidden compartment in his desk. It wasn't a secret safe, just a cleverly disguised drawer that required a specific sequence of button presses on the desk lamp. Inside, I found a manila folder, labeled simply, "Patricia, Contingency." My heart hammered against my ribs as I opened it. It contained not just financial records, but a series of letters, dated from the last few years of my father's life. Letters he had written to Patricia, but never sent. In them, he expressed his deep concerns about her spending habits, her emotional instability, and her increasing detachment from our family. He pleaded with her to seek help, to reevaluate her priorities. And then, I found something that made my blood run cold. Attached to one of the letters was a series of coded documents, accompanied by a separate, sealed envelope. The coding was complex, a cipher I vaguely recognized from a childhood spy game Richard and I used to play. My father, ever the lawyer, had been thorough. I spent days poring over the documents, cross-referencing them with the coded key. They weren't just financial records, they were evidence. Evidence of Patricia's dealings with individuals who were decidedly unsavory. There were offshore accounts, shell corporations, and records of large sums of money being funneled into what appeared to be speculative, high-risk ventures, some with ties to organized crime. My father had suspected it and had been gathering proof. The sealed envelope contained a detailed explanation from Richard himself. He had discovered Patricia's secret life, a life of gambling, risky investments, and, he suspected, something far more illicit. He knew she was bleeding their finances dry, and he feared she was putting our entire future at risk. He had tried to confront her, to understand, but she had always deflected, lied, or become hysterical. He realized he couldn't control her directly, not without causing a complete implosion. So he had begun his own investigation, using his legal acumen to uncover the truth. The coded documents were the culmination of his efforts. He had intended to use this information to protect me, to secure my inheritance, and perhaps to gently steer Patricia back to a more responsible path. But he had run out of time. The gravity of it settled on me like a suffocating blanket. Patricia wasn't just a reckless spender. She was involved in something dangerous. My father had left me not just an inheritance, but a responsibility. He had tasked me implicitly with dealing with this hidden threat. The humiliation of being left alone with $20 now seemed like a minor inconvenience compared to the potential consequences of Patricia's secret life. She had underestimated my father's intelligence, and now she was about to underestimate me. The initial shock gave way to a cold, hard fury. My father's quiet trust, his belief in my ability to handle this, fueled a dangerous resolve. I was no longer just the victim of my mother's neglect. I was the inheritor of my father's mission. I had to protect myself, and I had to protect his legacy. I met with Mr. Henderson again, laying the coded documents in Richard's explanation before him. His eyes widened as he deciphered the implications. He had suspected Patricia's recklessness, but this was far beyond anything he'd imagined. "Sarah," he said, his voice grave, "your father was a brilliant man. He saw this coming. This information, it's potentially explosive. It could ruin Patricia completely, not just financially, but legally." I nodded, my gaze fixed on the documents. He didn't want to hurt her, but he wanted to protect me. I have to honor that. The control Patricia had so craved was now completely out of her hands, but her rage, her desperation, was far from extinguished. She had threatened retribution, and now, armed with my father's research, I realized she might not just be seeking revenge on me. She might be trying to silence anyone who got in her way. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, but it also ignited a steely determination. I would not be a pawn in her dangerous game. I would be the one moving the pieces. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom, now transformed into a space of quiet contemplation, I looked at the scar on my elbow. It was no longer just a reminder of abandonment. It was a symbol of my survival, my resilience, and my readiness for what was to come. Patricia thought she had lost everything. She was wrong. She had lost the money, the status, the control, but she had unleashed something far more dangerous in her place. She had awakened the quiet child, the one who learned to observe, to strategize, and to wait. And her judgment day was coming. I could feel it. The air in the mansion was thick with anticipation, a silent promise of reckoning. The real game had just begun. The days that followed felt like walking on a razor's edge. Patricia, ousted from the mansion and her executrix role, was a storm brewing offshore. She'd vanished from public view, a chilling silence that was more unsettling than her usual histrionics. Mr. Henderson kept a watchful eye, his legal network buzzing with whispers about Patricia's sudden disappearance from her usual haunts. Aunt Carol, bless her pragmatic heart, tried to keep me grounded, insisting on normalcy: school, homework, dinner at 7 sharp. But normalcy felt like a flimsy shield against the undercurrents I now understood. The coded documents, Richard's unsent letters, they weren't just proof of Patricia's recklessness. They were a blueprint of a dangerous precipice, and my father had been trying to pull her back. Now it was my burden, my inherited responsibility. I spent hours in the study, poring over the manila folder. My father's elegant handwriting filled the pages of his notes, his meticulous analysis of Patricia's secret life. He'd suspected she was involved with some very bad people who wouldn't hesitate to leverage her desperate financial situation for their own gain. He traced the money, the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, all leading to a tangled web that hinted at something far more sinister than mere gambling debts. He documented her pattern, the escalating risks, the increasing secrecy, the desperate attempts to maintain a facade of wealth while drowning in debt. It was a chilling portrait of a woman consumed by a hunger for validation, a hunger that had led her down a path of ruin. One afternoon, Mr. Henderson called me into his office, his face grim. He'd been working with federal investigators, discreetly feeding them the information from my father's file. "Sarah," he began, his voice low, "your father's research is profound. It's uncovered evidence of significant financial fraud and potentially money laundering. Patricia has been deeply entangled. We've identified individuals who are, let's just say, not people you want to cross. They operate in shadows, and they don't take kindly to being exposed." He slid a photograph across his desk. It was a candid shot, clearly taken without permission, of Patricia meeting with a man in a dimly lit parking garage. The man was burly, his face shadowed, but his posture exuded an air of menacing authority. "This is Victor Martel," Mr. Henderson said, his gaze sharp. "He's known to have strong ties to organized crime. Your mother has been meeting with him regularly, making large cash withdrawals from accounts that seem to have no legitimate source of income. Your father suspected this connection, but he didn't have concrete proof of their direct involvement in illegal activities until now." A cold knot formed in my stomach. This was no longer about a spoiled woman squandering her inheritance. This was about survival, about protecting myself and my father's legacy from forces far more dangerous than I'd initially imagined. Patricia, in her desperate pursuit of wealth and power, had stumbled into a world that could swallow her whole and anyone associated with her. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "We play it smart," Mr. Henderson replied. "We let the authorities do their work. They have leverage now. Your father provided them with an excellent starting point. But your mother, she's unpredictable. She's cornered. She might do something desperate." He was right. Patricia's threats had never felt entirely empty, but now, knowing the caliber of people she was dealing with, her desperation became a tangible threat. She had lost everything she valued, her home, her status, her wealth, and she blamed me. She'd always blamed someone else for her unhappiness, her failures. Now I was the primary target. The next few weeks were a tense waiting game. I remained at the mansion, surrounded by Aunt Carol's steady presence, but the silence felt charged, heavy with unspoken anxieties. I avoided any direct contact with Patricia. Her phone calls, once frequent and hysterical, had ceased. Her emails, once full of accusations and pleas, were gone. It was as if she had evaporated, a phantom presence lurking in the periphery of my life. Then, one evening, as I was reviewing some of my father's financial records, looking for any further clues, my phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. I hesitated, then answered. "Sarah," a raspy voice, strained and unfamiliar, said. It took me a moment to recognize Patricia's voice, distorted by something other than tears. It was laced with the chilling hardness I'd never heard before. "Mom?" I said, my heart leaping into my throat. "Don't mom me," she hissed. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you've taken everything from me and gotten away with it. But you're wrong, so wrong." "What do you want?" I asked, my voice tight. "I want what's mine," she spat. "Richard left it to me. He promised me a life of luxury, not this pauper's existence you've condemned me to, you and that meddling lawyer of yours. Dad left me a future," I countered, my own anger starting to simmer. "You squandered it. You gambled it away." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Gambled? Oh, Sarah, you have no idea. You know nothing about the real world, do you? About what it takes to survive. Your father, he was a fool. He didn't understand that some debts can't be paid with money. Some debts require different arrangements." My blood ran cold. "What are you talking about?" "Martel," she said, the name a venomous whisper. "He understands. He knows how to get things done. And he's not happy, Sarah, not happy at all. He invested a lot of money, expecting a return. And now, thanks to your interference, that return is gone, and he wants compensation." The implications hit me like a physical blow. Patricia, in her desperation, had leveraged her illicit dealings with Martel, using the trust funds as collateral, or perhaps as a means to repay her debts. And now, with those funds frozen, she had nothing to offer him, and he would undoubtedly turn to her family, to me, to collect. "He's coming for me, isn't he?" I asked, my voice trembling. "He's coming for what he's owed," she corrected, a cruel smile in her voice. "And you, my dear Sarah, are now part of the Davenport estate. You inherited your father's wealth. You'll inherit his debts too. Think of it as a family tradition." The line went dead. I stood there, phone still in my hand, my mind racing. Patricia had not only betrayed my father's trust, but she had also put me in grave danger. She had opened the door to a world of violence and retribution, a world that my father had tried so desperately to shield me from. I found Mr. Henderson, my heart pounding in my chest, and explained the call. His face, usually composed, was etched with concern. "This is exactly what we feared," he said. "She's desperate, and she's using Martel. Martel is dangerous, Sarah, very dangerous. He won't hesitate to use force if he feels he's being cheated." "What can we do?" I asked again, the question now laced with a desperate urgency. "The authorities are already building a case against Martel and his associates," Mr. Henderson explained. "Your father's evidence was crucial. They're moving to arrest them, but they can't move fast enough to prevent Patricia from acting rashly. She's a loose cannon." I realized then that simply waiting for the legal system to catch up wasn't enough. Patricia, in her nihilistic rage, might do something irreversible. She had nothing left to lose, and she was willing to drag me down with her. That night, I couldn't sleep. The mansion, once a sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. I thought about my father, about his meticulous planning, his foresight. He had anticipated Patricia's recklessness, but perhaps he hadn't fully grasped the depth of her desperation. or the ruthlessness of the people she would involve herself with. He had left me a roadmap to protect myself, but it was a roadmap through a minefield. Then an idea, born from the desperate chill of the previous night's call, began to take shape. Patricia wanted money. She wanted control. She believed I had taken it all. But my father's will, his meticulous planning, had given me more than just access to assets. It had given me the means to control the narrative, to control the outcome. I went back to my father's study, to the hidden compartment. This time, I wasn't looking for more evidence of Patricia's misdeeds. I was looking for something else. My father, a lawyer to his core, believed in leverage. He believed in controlling information. He had gathered proof of Patricia's illegal activities, not just to protect me, but to ensure that if anything happened to him, I would have the power to dismantle her carefully constructed lies. I found it in a separate, smaller folder, tucked beneath the coded documents. It was a detailed accounting of every questionable transaction, every illicit offshore account, every shady deal Patricia had been involved in, meticulously documented with dates, amounts, and beneficiaries. It wasn't just evidence of fraud, it was a detailed exposé of her entire criminal enterprise, compiled with the precision only a seasoned lawyer could achieve. He had anticipated that Patricia, if left unchecked, would continue to engage in these activities. He had also anticipated that she might try to frame others or manipulate events to her advantage. The next day, I met Mr. Henderson again. I laid the second folder on his desk. "This is everything," I said, my voice steady, though my hands were clammy. My father's final contingency. He documented everything, not just her dealings with Martel, but the entire scope of her financial impropriety. It's all here. Every account, every transfer, every illicit connection. Mr. Henderson, after a thorough review, looked at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe and grim respect. "Sarah, this is comprehensive. This is more than enough to ensure not only Patricia's conviction, but also the dismantling of Martel's entire operation. He'll have no defense against this level of detail." "Patricia thinks she's the victim," I said, my gaze fixed on the documents. "She thinks I've taken everything from her. She's threatened retribution. She believes I'm vulnerable. And now you have the ultimate leverage," Mr. Henderson finished for me. The plan we devised was audacious and deeply unsettling. It involved playing into Patricia's desperation, her belief that she could manipulate the situation to her advantage. We waited. The authorities were closing in on Martel. His network was already fracturing. Patricia, isolated and panicked, would be desperate for a way out, a way to escape the consequences of her actions. The inevitable confrontation came, not in a sterile courtroom, but in a place that had once been the heart of our family's supposed happiness, the sprawling estate grounds. Patricia, in a desperate last-ditch effort, had orchestrated a meeting with me, claiming she had crucial information about Martel that I needed to know. She'd chosen the spot where my father had always held his summer barbecues, a place now overgrown and neglected, a mirror of her own decay. I arrived with Mr. Henderson and two plainclothes detectives who had been briefed on the situation. Aunt Carol, despite her protests, had been convinced to stay at the mansion, a safety precaution. The air was thick and humid, the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves heavy in the oppressive silence. Patricia stood near a gnarled oak tree, her figure a stark silhouette against the fading light. She looked gaunt, her designer clothes now ill-fitting and stained. Her eyes, however, burned with a feverish intensity. "You came," she said, her voice hoarse. "I wasn't sure you'd have the guts." "What do you want, Mom?" I asked, my voice deliberately calm. "I want out," she said, her voice cracking. "Martel is closing in. He knows I've been talking to people. He'll kill me. He'll kill us. But I have information, Sarah. Information that can bring him down. Your father, he helped me with some of this, you know. He believed in me, even when you didn't." The lie was so blatant, so pathetic, it almost made me pity her. But pity was a luxury I couldn't afford. "Dad didn't believe in your criminal enterprise," I said, my voice hardening. "He documented it. He left me everything to expose it." Her eyes narrowed, the flicker of desperation replaced by a flash of pure rage. "You think you're so clever, don't you? Playing lawyer, just like him. But you don't understand. This is bigger than you, bigger than him. It's about to be much smaller for you," I said, and I nodded subtly to Mr. Henderson. He stepped forward, his demeanor shifting from concerned advisor to prosecuting attorney. "Patricia," he began, his voice resonating with authority, "we have everything. Your father's meticulous documentation, coupled with the information gathered by federal investigators, leaves no room for doubt. We know about the offshore accounts, the shell corporations, the transfers to Martel's operatives. We have proof of money laundering, fraud, and conspiracy." Patricia's face contorted. No, that's not true. Richard loved me. He wouldn't have betrayed me like this. He loved you enough to try and save you, Patricia, I said, stepping forward. And when he realized he couldn't, he made sure I could. He gave me the means to protect myself and his legacy from your choices. I pulled out a copy of the second folder, the one containing my father's detailed exposé. This is your legacy, Mom. Not the mansion, not the jewels, but this, the truth. Her gaze fell on the folder, and her eyes widened in a dawning horror. She recognized the meticulous detail, the undeniable evidence. The carefully constructed facade of victimhood crumbled, revealing the raw, exposed fear beneath. You can't, she stammered, her voice trembling. Martel will kill you. He'll kill all of us. Martel's been apprehended, Mom, one of the detectives said, stepping forward. His operation is finished, and your cooperation, or lack thereof, will determine your sentence. Patricia looked at me, her face a mask of disbelief and fury. She had always seen me as a passive observer, a child to be manipulated. She had never imagined I possessed the strength, the intellect, or the ruthlessness to counter her. She had underestimated my father's foresight, and in doing so, she had sealed her own fate. You monster, she spat, her voice a venomous whisper, tears of pure rage finally streaming down her face. You've destroyed everything. You destroyed it, Mom, I said, my voice steady, devoid of the anger that had once fueled me. It was replaced by a weary resolve. I just uncovered the truth. She let out a guttural cry, a sound of utter defeat and despair, and then she collapsed, sobbing, onto the damp earth. The detectives moved in, their actions swift and professional. As they cuffed her, she looked at me one last time, her eyes filled with a hatred so profound it was almost palpable. But in that hatred, I saw not the triumph of a victim, but the pathetic rage of a bully who had finally been disarmed. Standing on that desolate patch of ground, watching the woman who had brought so much pain into my life being led away, a strange sense of calm settled over me. It wasn't happiness, not exactly. It was the quiet, profound relief of having survived. The humiliation, the years of neglect, the fear, they had all been crucible fires, forging a strength I never knew I possessed. My father had given me a future, and in doing so, he had given me a weapon. I hadn't sought revenge, not really. I had sought justice, for him, for myself, and for the life he had painstakingly tried to build. As the police cars drove away, leaving only the rustling of leaves and the heavy silence, I turned and walked back towards the mansion. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown lawn. It was no longer my childhood prison, or my mother's gilded cage. It was mine, a place of quiet strength, built on the foundations of truth and resilience. I had inherited my father's legacy, not just his wealth, but his integrity, his foresight, and his unwavering belief in justice. The game had been played, the pieces moved, and the final outcome was undeniable. I had finally, truly, come home. The air tasted clean, sharp, and full of a quiet, fierce victory.